details of DNS terminologies. So now we will continue our discussion to understand the DNS servers in better depth. So let us say the user types smarterbrains.in into the browser. Whenever the user does this, what exactly happens? So the smarterbrains.in is actually sent to the router, and the router actually contacts the ISP provider. Let us see how that works actually. So let's say I type some domain name over here. Just notice what happens at the bottom of this screen at this part. So let's say I am typing smarterbrains.in. It first resolved the host. Now it is waiting for smarterbrains.in to respond, and then it will actually get the data from that particular domain. So what actually happens in this meantime is it is contacting the registrar, that is GoDaddy. GoDaddy tells it that the domain name server is actually at Hostinger. So it goes to Hostinger, that is the top level domain name server. It sees that okay, I found the domain name records for the smarterbrains.in. You will get an answer from this particular server. So now the internet service provider actually queries the IP address from this server and then finally contacts the server for the content of the website. So as soon as it gets the content, it will actually serve you the content, and the domain name in the browser is still going to be smarterbrains.in. So as you can see, the domain is still smarterbrains.in. However, in the background, what happened is, say I use smarterbrains.in. The ping command in Linux or Mac will provide you the ability to resolve a specific IP address from the domain name. So you can see that it resolves to a specific IP address, right? Now, where did this IP address actually come from? So the IP address basically comes from the registrar. So registrar tells that my domain name server is ns1 dnsparking and ns2 dnsparking.com. Who has these servers? It's Hostinger. Now, in Hostinger, it will look for the records for smarterbrains.in. Since it is the root domain of hosting, the @ record here is pointing to the root domain, that is smarterbrains.in. So it will basically return you this specific address as you can see over here, right? So this is how it picked up a specific IP address. Let us try the same thing with a subdomain. Let's say I write a subdomain tutorial as the subdomain. Okay, it points to, let's say, some random IP address. Okay, so I created a record. Note that we have three parameters. There is a host, points to, and TTL. We will be discussing TTL in the further lecture. For now, let us understand what just happened. So we created a subdomain record where subdomain tutorial dot smarterbrains dot in points to some IP address. So now when you ping this, it will actually return you that specific IP address. You can see that the requests are timing out because this is not really a actual hosting server, right? So that is why the request will time out, which is expected. All right, so this is how you can create a DNS record. Now imagine what would happen if every time you type smarterbrains.in, the DNS needs to go through these many different servers. It would be a lot of to and fro cycles and a lot of waste of time. It took a lot of time for the ISP to actually fetch the website. So how do you avoid this? The internet service providers implement something called DNS caching. So DNS caching is basically a method which the ISP employs to avoid going through multiple servers to find out the domain name. Okay. So now let's say we created this IP address mapping for the domain. So now the server, the ISP provider basically knows that this domain points to 10.23.43.23. Okay. So it does not again and again go to authoritative server to find the IP address. But there is a problem with this. So the problem here is, what happens if the domain name is pointed to a different server? What happens then? So this is the problem for which TTL acts as the solution. So right now you can see that the domain still points to the same IP address, that is the old one, because the domain mapping has actually been cached at the ISP level. So in the next session, we will basically try to understand what exactly is TTL and how it actually helps us in avoiding this